Doom 2099 dropped in Marvel Snap, and right now his reception has been divisive. A lot of people are saying he's very strong, and a lot of people are saying he's very weak. Let's take a look at the card and then the decks that I've been playing him in High Infinite to see how strong you think that he ends up being. Doom 2099 is a 4-2 with an ability that states if you played one card this turn, he will make a Doom bot 2099. Note that this happens on the turn you play him, so when you play him, you also get a Doombot 2099 that turn. Doombot 2099 has an ongoing ability that says your other Doombots and Doom get +1 power. Now, these will appear at random locations around the board, making him a little bit tricky to play with and opening this strategy up to a weakness to clog strategies. However, the baseline point output of Doom 2099, thanks to multiple Doombots, is very, very high. You are normally going to be able to, if you play this guy on turn 4, get him up to 5 power and then 3 4-power Doombot 2099s. That's a very reasonably large 4-drop. In addition, he also works with Dr. Doom, the original version, with, again, this typical play pattern of Doom 2099 into 5-drop into Dr. Doom. Those Dr. Doom and those Doombots come down at 8 power. It's a very, very powerful and very potent strategy, but it does have some notable weaknesses. I think the most relevant of those weaknesses, especially right now with people still being new to deck building, is that people are over-invested in how good this card is. It is very strong. I don't want to sit here and act like it's not an extremely powerful card. The numbers that it creates, the numbers it puts on the board are quite large. The synergy with normal Dr. Doom is very relevant. But right now, a lot of people are indexing in it, in my opinion, in the wrong way, with Psylocke and Zabu and snapping every time it comes up like it's Mr. Negative. It's not Mr. Negative. It's a very good card, but if you snap aggressively on this card, you'll be right a decent amount of the time, but you'll also have some very damaging losses because there are certain cards that are extremely potent against it. For example, US Agent is an absolute monster against this strategy. It is completely and utterly disgusting. Lady Deathstrike is phenomenally strong against this guy as well. Even in a normal deck, I've been playing her in Arishem, but even in a normal deck, she will come down and she will blow this guy up. He will be a 4-3 on the turn Lady Deathstrike is revealed on turn 5. That's another really strong way to get super blown out. That is, I think, the major weakness of Doom 2099 right now. He is very strong, but people think he's a little bit stronger than he is, and he is extremely fragile and vulnerable to things like Lady Deathstrike, things like even a Red Guardian, and things like US Agent. With that in mind, it should come as very little surprise that the deck that I enjoyed the most with this card was a deck that did not over-index for anything. And that is, I think, something that is important to how I enjoy playing cards, but also has typically been correct long-term in terms of how to build this kind of stuff. Remember when Ajax came out and I was like, oh, you need to play this in a small package in something that's already good? That was correct. When Annihilus came out, oh, you need to play this in a small package and something that's already good? That was right too. So what does that look like in terms of not over-indexing? It means that my favorite decks for Doom 2099 are not overly invested in getting a Psylocke or a Zabu out on the board in order to cheat him out early. Yes, it's awesome when it happens, but it's not worth running those cards. So I needed to find a mid-range deck that actually just wanted to play one card a turn, and Scream was a natural fit here. There are two choices here that I think maybe other people wouldn't make. They are Red Guardian and Sandman. Let's talk about both because I think both are going to reveal some truths about 2099 that might be helpful. Red Guardian is quite strong right now, just in a general sense, but one of my big fears when I'm playing a deck like this that doesn't actually have, Shang-Chi or Shadow King, is that someone is able to go over the top of me in a meaningful way. Typically that ends up looking a lot like move bounce or even normal bounce. Red Guardian is great into that, but also Red Guardian solves a lot of problems that you would otherwise mostly be unable to solve. Red Guardian can blow up an Iron Man if you run up against Tribunal. Red Guardian can blow up a Madam Web, which nothing else in the game can really actually do. And that kind of stuff is very important to have the ability to interact with, because if you're a deck like this that just does points, someone doing points better than you will beat you. And I think that this, especially when a bunch of people are playing Doom 2099, it's important to have the ability to interact because of the way that this card wants you to aggressively snap it. And if you aggressively snap it and then run into someone playing move bounce, right? You need that Sandman, you need that Red Guardian, because otherwise they're over the top of you, and it doesn't matter that you played a 417, they're playing a 30 power Human Torch. Now, I did mention I don't like over-indexing for Doom 2099, which means, running cards specifically to make it make sense. I can see how you could look at an Arishem deck and say, oh, you're over-indexing for 2099, you're running cards to make it make sense, and referring to specifically the card Arishem. I'm not sure how true that is, so much as it is that Arishem was crying out for another Elite 4-drop, and it just showed up. This is a card that has massive synergy with Arishem. Obviously, it's a 4-drop. A lot of Arishem's power is concentrated on snowballing 4-drops now. We only had Galacta, really, previously, and so this is a very easy inclusion, even if it didn't have the additional Mockingbird synergy that it has. This card is phenomenal the earlier you get it out. It's just not worth actually making the sacrifice to make that happen a lot of the time. It can be, contextually. There are going to be some Zabu Psylocke decks on this list, and we'll talk about them as fairly as we can. But generally speaking, when you have a card like this, you want to maintain a balance between it and the other stuff in your deck. And the more you over-index for just it, the worse off you are. This is using the parts of the buffalo a little bit better, basically. It's not just, oh, I need to ramp out Doom 2099 or I'm gonna die. It's, you're an Arishem deck. You get to do whatever you want, and then when you draw Doom 2099, it's awesome. This is as good as Arishem has felt since the nerf to me. I think we're gradually moving closer and closer to a list that is cohesive, but I will note that there are some tech choices that are very much inbred here. We have Lady Deathstrike, of course, very inbred against opposing Doom 2099 decks and clog decks that people are playing to beat Doom 2099. We have Killmonger for the same reason, anti-clog tech. We really don't want to deal with getting clogged as a Doom 2099 deck. And we have no Shang-Chi, again, meta call here. A lot of people are playing Doom 2099 and going under what Shang-Chi is able to actually deal with. This is not a permanent state of affairs, so I do think those spots are going to be in flux. But right now, I feel fairly confident that this is an Arishem list that makes a ton of sense. I know I just did a whole spiel about Psylocke and stuff like that and how much I don't like her, but I will say that this list, which I believe was cooked up by KX4N, does a pretty good job of convincing me to run Psylocke, again, because it's in a deck that was already doing it. I don't want to go out and make a new deck that's running Psylocke Doom 2099. I want to put Doom 2099 in my Psylocke decks, in as much as they exist. In my Arishem decks, the decks that are going to get to do that because they already want to do that. And Doom 2099, or 2090 negative, as I've begun to call it, is, I think, actually a pretty solid option in Mr. Negative, and I'll tell you why. This is a card that allows you to have a nut draw that is not Mr. Negative that can still actually win games. You are no longer locked into the negative or bust plan. If you hit the negative, I mean, that's great. You're popping off. That's amazing. If you don't hit the negative, but you do hit a turn 3 Doom 2099, that can be nearly as strong. It takes the deck from being purely one note to a deck that can actually just win games even when it doesn't hit Mr. Negative. There's some additional upside here too. As so many people are playing these Doom 2099 decks, and as so many of them don't really run a lot of tech, this is the kind of thing that can really win mirrors. The one thing you're going to want to keep an eye out for is Super Scroll. A lot of people are running that as a quote-unquote mirror breaker. I'm not the biggest fan of it. It makes sense in here because, you know, Mr. Negative, Doom 2099 is out there. But I do think that it does provide what would be a reasonable counter to this strategy. It's just like, you are a Mr. Negative deck facing off against a bunch of Doom 2099 decks that don't have any interaction for you. So you basically get to bully them when you do the thing that you want to do. You have the ability to get the Doom 2099 out earlier than them. There's a lot that this deck can do, and it is, I think, about as well positioned in a Doom 2099 metagame as it could ever be. Mr. Negative is a good choice right now, and I do think that Doom 2099 makes the deck better in a meaningful way. So let's say you wanted to ignore everything I said and run a deck that is actually a little more all in on Doom 2099. If you were to do that, I would suggest running this one, actually also cooked up by KX4N. With the assistance of Derek, they differ basically entirely on Black Panther versus Vision, otherwise it's exactly the same. They both kind of independently arrived at almost the exact same list, and it's not that hard to see why. The basic premise here is we have this really awesome 4-drop Galacta, we have this really awesome 4-drop Doom 2099, we are going to get one of them out on 3 and then just do stupid stuff the entire rest of the game. Ultimately, if anything holds this deck back, it's that I suspect Arishem is doing this in a better way. It is not devoting actual deck slots to, like, Zabu and Psylocke and stuff. It's running things that actually curve out and are able to leverage its energy advantage. It's not always going to be better, but I think in a general sense, I would rather be playing Arishem than a Zabu Psylocke deck if I was going to be a Doom 2099 Galacta deck, which I think all Arishem decks are at this point. The deck from there is actually just very straightforward. We have a lot of good hits for Iron Lad. Obviously, both of the 4s are ridiculous hits, but stuff like Black Panther is pretty ridiculous as well. There's obviously the ability to hit a Dr. Doom, and the deck should sort of play itself from there. It runs a risk of, like, getting behind on tempo and getting tech carded out. And so, like, there are decks where it's like, when you look at this, ultimately what's happening here is we have no tech at all for anything other than the mirror, right? Like, that's what Super Scroll is doing. We are gonna get run over by Move Bounce. We are gonna get run over by a lot of US Agent decks. And I think that ultimately this is the kind of deck that I don't think is going to make it very far, but I do think is a good example of what it looks like to invest fully in a Doom 2099 shell. I think it's good, but I think that there are other options that generally end up better. So basically, what I'm saying is, this is sort of like, you must be this tall to ride as a Doom 2099 deck. If you cannot argue that you are better than this deck that we're talking about right now, I don't think you're going to make it. That said, we still have 2 more angles to talk about, 2 more decks to talk about, both taking unique angles here. This one comes from Ica, and I enjoyed like 2/3 of this deck, but I didn't enjoy the other 2/3. And what I mean by that is, I didn't like that this deck had so little in the way of early game and was so heavily invested in the Doom 2099. A lot of what I'm talking about in terms of that comes from playing this deck. Like, this was the deck that made me think, I just need to put this in Scream. Like, I just need to play a deck that actually can curve like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I need to do that. I don't need to play this Psylocke stuff because of how awkward it felt. What I did like here, there are a couple of choices that I think are pretty inspired. The first is Blink. Just a good card, period. You don't want to do it on your Doom 2099, but like, blinking a leech is like a reasonably strong thing to do, absolutely. The second is Luke Cage. Again, there's a little bit of awkwardness with actually using him, but if you can get him on the board, he's one of the best ways, or really the only good way, at stopping yourself from getting completely owned by US Agent. And the third is Killmonger. We talked about how many people are playing Clog stuff in order to beat the crap out of you. Killmonger can help that matchup in a way few other cards can. Now, is this going to make a ton of sense long term? I doubt it. It seems like it'll probably win mirrors specifically, but beyond that, I worry that as people swap off of Doom 2099 and more towards countering Doom 2099, you end up in an awkward spot. And I think more than that, If I wanted to win mirrors of Doom 2099 really hard, I would be playing 2090 negative, which has an incredibly powerful snap condition that is basically unbeatable when you run into another Doom 2099 deck. Finally, Zombies Go Nom Nom cooked up a Dazzletron list that I genuinely enjoy, but I think this list, more than many other lists, is going to suffer from being so all in on this. This is the kind of list that gets heinously blown out by like the tech cards, right? And that's why it needs to have the loot cage in there, because I don't think you can afford to play this list without it. But what this does is create a lot of weird and awkward situations that are hard for you to figure out the right play in because you don't have a lot of necessarily good options. Picture this. It's turn 5. You're afraid of US Agent. You have this Iron Man that you could play or a loot cage. You have to actually make a sacrifice to play the loot cage a lot of the time if you didn't draw it earlier than you needed to. And that kind of stuff is a testament to me of like the general awkward construction and deck building requirements of Doom 2099. I think a lot of people looked at this card and said it was going to be a free inclusion in a bunch of stuff. And I think that having played with it, it is strong, but it is fragile. It has notable weaknesses, and it's anything but a free inclusion in a lot of decks. So, should you buy Doom 2099? I am generally in favor of this card. I think it is quite strong. I think it has very good ability to deal with what people are able to output. I think it is extremely relevant and will likely continue to be relevant going forward, but I don't think it's broken. I think there's a lot of noise about this card being broken. I don't think it's made it to that level. I think it's possible that over time it becomes that, but this is not a card that's going to release and it's going to be like, this card has a 60% win rate. It's not that. It's a card that might have deleterious effects on the metagame long term if it is able to be as strong as it is. But right now, the counters feel pretty meaningful and pretty strong as well, and they are keeping him in check as far as I'm concerned. If you wanted to play something like Clog, if you wanted to play a US Agent deck, or do both at the same time, both of those are very viable options against a lot of these decks. Part of the reason I enjoyed the Arishem and the Scream decks as much as I did is because they have built-in options against that stuff. The Scream deck has Hydra Bob, and it has Jeff in it, so we don't necessarily always get clogged to death, right? The Arishem deck has multiple tech cards for the clog stuff. I think that's indicative of what this card really is. He's straightforward, he's powerful, but his weaknesses are stark, and they do matter. And it's a question of the long term as to whether or not this guy becomes the thing that mid-range decks centralize around, or if something else along those lines comes back and takes his throne. Right now, if I had to guess, I would guess that this card remains relevant for a while. He seems quite powerful, and I do think that he is generally worth investing in. I also think that people are over-indexing for him right now, and we may not have seen him at his highest potential. I personally believe that Scream and Arishem are the best shells for him by a lot. If you are an Arishem gamer, I strongly suspect that you're gonna want to pick this card up. As always, this is only day one, and while there isn't an OTA coming up, you can still wait just a little bit. This is not the kind of thing that you need to rush into, especially with the caches also containing Dakin and Meek, which are not cards I would recommend opening for. So, take your time, figure out where this guy settles, and see if you like what he's doing. Because I think there are certain decks that are really going to want him. He solves problems for Scream. He solves problems for Arishem. But I'm not so sure that the all-in Doom 2099 stuff sticks around. I do think that if you're a Scream, Arishem, or Negative gamer, you're probably going to want to look into him a lot more closely. If you're agnostic on that stuff, give it a little bit of time. All right, y'all. Thank you so much for watching that video. As always, I have been KM Best. You have been phenomenal. And I will see you in the next one as soon as you remember to like and subscribe.